that you talked on the importance of labor industry in India, labor intensive industry, because we have a comparative advantage in labor intensive industries. And recently we saw that the government did liberalize a lot of labor laws in the country. So do you see that these labor reforms will have a positive impact, and what more can we do to ensure that there is more labor intensive industry and more light manufacturers which our economy focuses on?
That's a very good question, the most important question, I would say. Yes, labor law reforms have been done and they'll be very helpful. There is one provision, however, which still doesn't go far enough. One very important provision, which is that it's still in the new codes. It's the code on industrial relations. Any enterprise, any firm, any company which has more than 300 workers basically does not have the right to terminate workers. And enterprises have to have that right, and most enterprises around the world actually have that kind of right. Enterprises are there to employ people. They are not interested in firing workers. But sometimes the discipline is very hard to impose if the workers know that they can never be fired, and so the efficiency also suffers and all. So the enterprises have to be able to, if some workers are simply creating indiscipline, that sort of thing, they have to have that right. Now, the law actually gives the states the right to raise that limit, and states don't have to pass any new laws. They just can do it by notification. So I would like, some states, some forward-looking states to come forward and do that. Not every state has to do it. If 3 or 4 would do it, that's good enough, because no enterprise locates itself in all 28 states. They are going to often, you can look at any country, China, for example. You got 3 or 4 big states along the coast, on southeastern coast, which is where the economic activity really concentrated. So if some states can do it, that will help. So that's something very important. What else can be done? We need the land to become less expensive. Our land laws still remain, on land laws we have had no reforms really, and that reform is very, very crucial, because particularly for labor intensive products, if you're going to get the kind of scale, where you employ 30,000, 40,000 people in your enterprise. I mean, some of the Chinese firms operate on scales that go to 100,000 workers or 200,000 workers. That's the kind of scale that they operate on. So we may not want to go to that kind of scale, but 20, 30,000 worker kind of scale, you need space for that. And these labor intensive industries operate on very thin margins. Margins are very low. So they need land to be not so expensive. So we need something to be done there. We also need electricity pricing to be streamlined. Today, industry pays punishing prices on electricity because everybody else gets subsidized.
Yeah.
That is wrong. In the end, you should pay for the poor. We can do some, so up to a certain amount, you can say free electricity you can give. But on the margin, if your consumption exceeds a certain limit, then proper price, market price ought to be charged. And if we do that, then this cross subsidy can be then eliminated. Right now, there's a lot of cross subsidy from the industry to the households and farmers and so forth, and that is detrimental. So there are some of these other things on which we need to work. The exchange rate, rupee needs to weaken a little bit. It's in my view, I think it's still a little bit overvalued, which should then that doesn't make exports attractive enough, and that again matters a lot for these industries, labor-intensive industries, which operate on relatively very thin margins, because the global marketplace for these products is absolutely super competitive.
Yes. So the 4 important points which you mentioned, first was the labor reforms, then the land reforms, then there's a need to reduce the subsidies on electricity which households get, and the 4th was that a rupee needs to be depreciated a little more.
Yeah.
On the labor laws, you have also pointed in your book India Unlimited that even the wage code is not very reformist, because it has different minimum wages for different skills of different labor skills. So even that is something which hampers scaling.
Yes, I should have mentioned that also. Yeah, I mean, I can hardly think of any country which has these multiple kind of minimum wages, depending on the level of skills. And you know, the whole idea behind the philosophy behind it is that somebody, you know, some sort of minimum wage ought to be given. But there is no philosophy that says that because if you're more educated, then you should get you should get twice the wage or thrice the wage of those who are not educated. That's simply wrong. You know, then the market has to determine the price, you know, and demand shifts happen over time, and so the wages have to be able to respond to those. So that also is important. And also I think there is, you know, we've been trying to do some national level of minimum wage, and that can be, you know, if the national level minimum wage is set at the level of Delhi or Bombay, then the second tier, third tier cities will get killed. You see, for these labor intensive apparel manufacturers, I've talked to the best of our apparel manufacturers, and they say that they can't operate in Delhi or Mumbai because cost of living is so incredibly high that the wages they will have to pay will completely price them out of the global market. So they go to the second tier, third tier kind of cities. But if the minimum wage is set kind of, you know, keeping national minimum wage, that is, you know, if it is set too high, there is a problem. So I think, you know, minimum wage ought to be set. I mean, the US also is trying to do that. There's a federal minimum wage of $15 or something. That's a crazy way to do it. Although in the US, it matters less because the cost of living differences are not so large. But in India, cost of living differences are very large depending on, you know, what kind of city you're in. So I would rather leave it to the local governments to do the minimum wages.
Yeah, that's
So,
very important.
so sorry to
Uh,
interrupt. Yeah. So just following up on the point that you made on India's forex rate being high and that it needs to be adjusted, do you think instead of having a national wage code or a minimum wage, we this like a change and a drop in India's currency valuation can help alleviate this problem? So China already financially engineers their currency exchange rate and keeps it down in order to facilitate trade, just like we said. So do you think if we are able to sort of do that, would it really help us reduce the labor cost or the total cost that the local manufacturers face and increase exports at the same time?
So the question is about the exchange rate.
So it's a
yes.
mix. It's also about instead of having a national level minimum wage, can say a change in the exchange rate also capture this extra, like the difference in the minimum wages across different jurisdictions in India? So I'm not an economic student per se, so I just wanted to understand your point of view on the same. Is there any correlation? Is there sort of a regressive analysis you can run here? Are these variables dependent, codependent? How
Yeah,
does
they
it?
will depend on, you know, ultimately, right? Yeah. So look, minimum wage is set by the government. That's a legal wage. And what is market wage is a different wage. And if you really set the minimum wage too high up relative to what the market will do for any given exchange rate, then some of the enterprises will become unprofitable. And so, whereas those who get employed will get that high minimum wage, many workers will simply not get employment, and they then get forced into the self-employment. I mean, either you get unemployed or you find, you know, something to do on your own. Enterprises will not be able to employ you. So first of all, the minimum wage should not be fixed up too high up relative to where the market will bring you. Now, do the wages themselves depend on the exchange rate? Of course they do, because wages will depend on the rate of inflation. And rate of inflation has some connection to the exchange rate as well. And usually remember that the exchange rate advantage doesn't last long. It is dissipated precisely by this, that eventually the inflation catches up. And so in nominal terms, generally you will see that the domestic currency in a growing economy, and where also the inflation is usually higher than in the outside world, you will see that in nominal terms, the domestic currency over time does depreciate. Rupee to the dollar at independence was at 4 rupees to a dollar, right? And then even if you go to 1991, it's somewhere like 20 rupees to a dollar. Today, it's about 70 rupees to a dollar. So in nominal terms, that depreciation happens because inflation rate in India, let's say, is significantly higher than in the rest of the world. And that calls for depreciation of the rupee on its own.
Thank you so much, sir. So another
Abhijit, you can only have one question per student. If time permits, we'll have more questions later. We'll have to take questions from other students as well.
Sure, no problem. Sir, could we perhaps email it to you later if that's possible?
You can try. I don't guarantee. That all
Yes,
depends
thank you,
on.
Abhijit.
Thank you, sir.
The next question, sir, is from Vishal, who is asking you that contrary to a popular perception in India and in a lot of places around the world, you have said that a country cannot reduce its imports while trying to keep up its exports. So why is that, and why do you think there is this popular perception among many people in the world?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Very, very good question. Yeah. Well, reverse the question for a minute, right? Reverse the question for a minute. That suppose you expand your imports, right? Suppose you expand your imports. You have to pay for your imports. How do you pay for your imports? There are three ways. One is that you export and therefore generate more foreign exchange to pay for these imports. Second is that somebody makes you transfers. That's largely remittances, we receive from overseas Indians. And the third is that you incur debt abroad. You borrow. Right? Now, first of all, remittances are given, it depends on how much the Indians abroad are remitting foreign exchange to the Indians. That's a given thing. You can't change that so dramatically. How much you can borrow abroad is also an issue, right? The Reserve Bank of India will not allow you to borrow so much that tomorrow there is a crisis as we had in 1991. Now, how much you borrow is exactly the amount which is the current account deficit. Current account deficit is really the gap between the exports plus remittances and the imports. Okay, the current account deficit, and the current account deficit, the Reserve Bank of India more or less ensures it stays between 1 to 2%. Anytime it goes beyond 2%, Reserve Bank of India gets very upset and it lets the rupee depreciate. Basically, it lets the rupee depreciate, which tries to bring the exports and imports back into balance. So you don't have much flexibility in terms of expanding your imports, either through more remittances or through excessive borrowing. In the end, only way you can import more is by exporting more. So that if you look at the series, exports and import series of any country, pick it up, they move together. Exports rise, imports rise, imports rise, exports rise. So that's the way to look at it. And so generally, if you're trying to cut imports, not reverse, if you want to ask the question in the reverse, if you're trying to cut imports, you're trying to produce more domestically of those goods that you import. Well, then the capital will have to move out of some other sectors into these sectors. Well, that'll hit the exports.
Yes, that's a very important point.
And the reason it's not so easy to see is that because the impact that happens outside of where your action is, right? Your action, when you say reducing imports, you impose more tariffs, which puts a barrier actually in the way of imports. And so that if I impose tariff on, let's say, mobile telephones, my mobile imports will decline because they rise in price. All of us will start buying more domestic variety mobiles rather than the foreign variety mobiles or domestically produced mobiles. That we can see very right away. But what we don't see is that, there is an indirect effect which is equally powerful or more powerful. That's not so visible to us. But in the end, from somewhere, these resources will have to come. This capital that goes into more mobile manufacturers in India will have to come from somewhere. And that's where we don't see that. That's why, that impact is too indirect for most people to see.
The larger unseen effect is not seen, whereas only the concentrated benefit which the mobile industry gets is only noticed.
Yeah, exactly.
Sir, so Shreya has an interesting question. So you have recently stated that a lot of external events helped in changing the minds of our bureaucrats, which led to liberalization in the 1990s. So can you throw some light on what were these events which led us to reform in 1991? And on this point.
Okay. Good. Again, another very good question. So first of all, when we went into this planning system, license, permit, Raj, and very large public sector and all, the model was the Soviet model. So I think by the time most of you were born, probably there was no Soviet Union, but Russia is the kind of successor to the Soviet Union. This was a very, planned economy model and all. And at that time in the 1950s, it was supposed to be success. And remember that all this Cold War, meaning there's this competition between the United States, the capitalist economy, and Soviet Union, the socialist economy. But by the time all of you were born, probably that competition was over. So by 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. And anybody who could argue about the Soviet Union being a powerful economy, etc., was over. You could no longer argue. That's one. Second thing was that, if I track the history, intellectual history, when 1950s, everybody is protectionist. There are very few voices against it. Even our guide, leading light of free trade, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, 1950s, you won't see him, in the way he, and even a book 1970 that he and his wife Bhagwati and Desai wrote was relatively mild in terms of liberalization. It's clearly pro-liberalization, and so it was the first book that got written on liberalization, but not in the way that you would see him argue today, or you would have seen him in 1980s onwards. But as Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, they grew so rapidly, by the 1970s, the conventional wisdom had shifted in favor of freer trade. Now in India, you got no salience. Bhagwati and Desai book got completely ignored. Nobody paid attention. And if anybody did, they were arguing against it vehemently. And the argument would be that, Singapore and Hong Kong, they are little city states. They don't, really mean anything for India. Even South Korea, it's a smaller country and it's homogeneous, and, population, we are very diverse, we are large, this, that, and the other. But then, late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping came along in China, and he looked at Hong Kong and he looked at Taiwan, and then he looked at his own coastline and said, what are those guys doing right, and what is it that we are doing wrong? And he opened up Chinese economy and all, and then, by 1990, they had grown 10%. They had crossed India's per capita income. They're clearly emerging as a promising power. That I think simply, and that was a communist country at that, and larger in population than India. You could not any longer argue that, this model doesn't apply to us because we are much larger and we are much more diverse, etc. So I think that those two major developments, the decline of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, made all the difference.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. There is another question from Saurabh. on how do you think liberalization of the trade policies in 91 helped the Dalit entrepreneurs in India, because they were not the elite groups who had access to the chambers of license, which was granted before 91. So do you think it has also helped in social inclusion in a lot of ways?
Well, Saurav has already answered the question, you know. So in fact, it's very nice, you know, if you can dig that out. Even I may have written somewhere, maybe in the India, the Emerging Giant or somewhere. Somewhere I wrote, I'm not sure where I can find out. But some of the Dalit entrepreneurs themselves have written, saying that, look, you know, before, who would give us license? Nobody would give us license. And so you see, no Dalit entrepreneurs actually till the liberalization happened. And then, of course, you know, post-liberalization, so many Dalit entrepreneurs. I mean, now there is a separate, you know, I think it was Chandrabhan, right? He started one of the Dalit, really major entrepreneurs, Dalit entrepreneurs. He really started a new industry body, Dicky, Dalit Industrial Chamber of Commerce or something. You know, so clearly for the Dalits, it opened up big avenues for the entrepreneurship. Yeah. And I've written also, you know, even you can see that post-liberalization, you see even at a more aggregate, I mean, you know, more macro data. I wrote a paper with Rajiv Dahiria, where I looked at the data, and you see clearly that, you know, as the economy grows, particularly with the Dalit, you know, the problem is more with the tribals. See, tribals tend to be a bit, you know, outside the mainstream. See, Dalits are essentially, you know, part of the general economic activity. And they, you know, and their rural-urban split is not very different from the rural-urban split of the general population. But tribes tend to be more concentrated in rural areas, and even within rural areas, they sort of sit more separately than the rest of the economy. So the impact, so there, I think targeted action is always more effective. I mean, the case for targeted action for the tribals is a lot stronger, and that's where I would focus the efforts personally. But even there, you get the impact, and you see some impact, not quite as much. You know, Dalits come up as the economy comes up. And in the poverty data, that is so clear. Tribals also get impacted positively, but not to the same extent.
Yes, that's an important point. Shreya, so Shreya has a question. You have argued very strongly in favor of the agricultural marketing reforms which were recently undertaken by the government. But do you think there is also now a need for a lot of land reforms when it comes to agriculture? So NITI Aayog had proposed the Model Land Leasing Act in 2016, but only few states have implemented it in spirit. So what can be done to ensure that we move more people out of agriculture and have consolidation of land holdings for better?
Well, answer obviously is yes. 2016, who was at the NITI Aayog? So that was actually, I started, you know, I brought in this, I was very directly involved in the land leasing model act that we wrote. Very much required, you see, because you see, the old times, the issue was that, look, you know, big landlords are the ones who would want to lease the land, right? And what the philosophy behind behind a ban on any land leasing was that actually the tiller ought to own the land, right? And so the laws got written in the backwards way, which were okay in those times, probably, that, you know, look, if the we want the tiller to have the right to land, and so therefore leasing is not permitted, right? But anyway, that was not very successful because, you know, big landlords were very powerful at the state level, and so the land ceilings that were introduced were very high in the first place, and then also, you know, they distributed land among their relatives and so forth on the paper. So anyway, that didn't succeed. Now what we are stuck with is that, you know, tenancy is still not permitted. Now what is happening is that the small guys are the ones who want to lease out land, not lease in. See, previously the idea was the small guys will want to lease in and they should be given the land and they should have the right to it. But now actually it is the small guys who want to lease it out and go and do some work in the city, or do something that will be more productive. Because currently half of our land holdings are less than half hectare. I mean 48%, so roughly half of them are less than half hectare. And if you take the average of those, it's less than a quarter hectare. Who can make a living on a plot of less than a quarter hectare? Nobody can. And the productivity is also low as a result. You can't use any machinery, you can't use any modern agriculture there and all. So this is required. So that's one reform that is needed. But of course, much more to me, what is important is that we do necessary things for the creation of well-paid jobs in industry and services. See, unfortunately, our obsession, if you will, or our kind of, focus still remains on these very, high-tech industry.
Yes.
We want to do the, that Nehruvian kind of sense of, that we got to conquer the commanding heights of the industry and all, that still remains. And that is something even our own entrepreneurs are really hardwired to do that. They want to do petroleum refining, they want to do pharmaceuticals, they want to do machinery, they want to do chemicals, but nobody wants to, stitch clothes or make shoes. That sort of, is not a part of the thinking process of our entrepreneurs. And that's where but most workers cannot be employed in those industries. High finance, information technology, only very few people, very tiny fraction of the population can be employed in those industries, and their capacity to employ is also that much. Their per unit of capital investment, they don't employ that many workers. Whereas, apparel, footwear, furniture, these industries can employ large number of workers for very limited investment. And that is where the jobs need to be created, so that workers from the countryside can move to these jobs. Workers from rural areas can move to these jobs. So we still have, some 42% of the workers in these in agriculture, which is far too large. So yes, land reforms we need, but also, some of the benefits, for example, when you tie them up, that you can get Narega money only if you are in rural areas, or you can get your ration, subsidized food grain only if you are in the rural area or something. That then creates an incentive not to migrate. So our policies also have tended to be a bit of anti-migration, anti-rural urban migration. And that also needs to change a bit. You talk to our bulk of our urban population, though they themselves live in urban areas, they're very anti-rural urban migration. They're living such a peaceful life in rural areas, glorification of the rural life. But ask the fellow, who is not able to get 2 meals a day. They all want to, and all progress happens from migration. And when you are young, look, I couldn't be where I am unless my father had moved out of his village and ultimately eventually landed in Jaipur, from where then we could get our education, his children meaning and all. And so progress happens through migration. It may be initially painful also. And that also then comes back to this idea of making the cities friendlier to migrant workers. You see, again, our urban policies are all directed at giving, say, the urban housing schemes. They try to give the urban poor subsidized houses, owner-occupied houses. But the migrant cannot afford those. Migrant is not even offered that. What migrant needs is some simple dormitory type of housing where he can come sleep, do the chores, morning chores, and go back work. They want to work 12 hours a day, 18 hours, whatever, large number of, and earn good bit of income, go back. Or if they are going to settle, it'll take time. Initially, they need a foothold from where they can begin to, earn some real income. So some low rental housing for the migrants, and this can be dormitory kind of housing, is also very much required. But we're not focused on that. We really have been focusing all our urban policy to providing subsidized owner-occupied housing, which requires a large number of resources, whereas, so again, for that also, this could come up commercially, except that the land prices in urban areas in India are so excessively high because of the urban land very restricted, right? The cities expand and enterprises come and locate on the periphery of a city. It could be two-tier city or tier 1 city, whatever it is, but they come into the periphery of the city and they want to locate there. That land is agricultural. It should be easily convertible from agricultural, and don't force it. But if you convert the land from agricultural to non-agricultural, farmer himself seeing how good the price becomes once it's converted from agricultural to non-agricultural, the farmers will want to actually convert it themselves. But that conversion has to be allowed easily by the revenue departments of the states.
Yes.
So these are some of the things, make cities more hospitable to migrants, and also do the land reforms within the rural areas so that that these people can lease out their land to migrate.
With respect to housing for the migrants, you have also suggested changes to the Urban Land Ceiling Regulation Act and changes to the floor tax regulation.
Yeah, all those. I mean, all those. Plus, very importantly, you see, the other thing we do. I talk sometimes about this thing. That we are a nation of tiny economic units. And the same even goes for urban housing. What do? We don't allow tall buildings, especially in the city center. There would be no Singapore, there will be no New York City, there will be no Hong Kong if these cities did not allow very, very tall buildings. But look at Mumbai. Any small, I mean, even in Mumbai, even on the periphery, Andheri, etc., Bandra Kulra, etc., which is not really South Bombay. The tall buildings is a very recent phenomenon.
Yes.
But in South Bombay, it still is not. It's a no-no. So South Bombay is totally flat if you look at it. What sense does it make? That's a prime land where the business activity takes place. Allow, the buildings there should be of the size of the Empire State Building and the, World Trade Towers and so forth. So we need that also.
Where in the middle of the city it is most important, we don't allow it. Whereas
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Sir, the next question is from Ankur with respect to poor contract enforcement in our courts. So because our courts are very inefficient, we rank nearly 160 when it comes to enforcement of contracts in the ease of doing business index. So what stops the government, and is there any incentive for the government to reform the court system?
Yeah, look, I think there are two areas, maybe three, where the reform has not even started.
Yes.
Judiciary, police, defense. It really is. Now the trouble is, judiciary itself has to carry out most of these reforms. The government can't do it. And so, and the judges have no, there is just no incentive. I mean, you need leadership in the judiciary, and that it's not there. And if the government tries to do it with the people, the whole, everybody will jump at the government.
Yes.
For tempering or something, that they're trying to. I don't know what you do. Police is the state responsibility. Again, unless much of this reform has to happen at the level of the states, no initiative at all. So these, yeah, I mean, I don't know what I can say on this. I'm not an expert either, but I just note and see the problems. And so you can see I've not written much on these subjects myself, actually, only because, I try to knock where there is some possibility of action. Here I'm sort of painting a rather pessimistic picture, as you can see. And look, I mean, we know all very right now what has been happening in Bombay, Bombay police and all the kinds of things that have transpired. It's a complete, not just embarrassment, but shame where we are on that front. So yeah, I don't know what to say. And defense also that way, I think, requires a lot of reform. The bureaucrats rule the defense sector. It shouldn't be. I mean, all the generals have in the United States offices in the Pentagon and all. They ultimately they are the defense, and they have to be part of the defense ministry in a more active kind of form. Now, this probably was in 50s and 60s. I can understand that there was some fear that somehow allowing the generals into the administration, anywhere near the administration, would could potentially destabilize the democracy and so forth, right? That there may be a military coup or some sort of this used to be the kind of talk in the 50s and 60s when I grew up. So there was some fear, and I remember there's a story of one time a general, or probably not even general, but some army officer came in the uniform to the defense ministry, and Nehru was very upset and angry that this is not a place to display your uniform and all. But those were different times. I think now so there's a lot of the defense ministry also requires a lot more reform. But the bureaucracy controls that with very tight fist.
Yes, that's true. Nakul has a question on India's vaccination program. So we have followed the vaccine Matri program without the support of the Quad. Or would you prefer a paradigm where the exports will be carried out by the logistical support of other countries in the Quad like Australia and Japan?
Well, I mean, who would be against that cooperation? Absolutely, we should use wherever we have the possibility, and if Australia as a part of the Quad diplomacy becomes a partner in that, so much so good. So yes, I think and if the Quad also brings in financial resources to rapidly expand the manufacturing of vaccines, I think that's very welcome also, because we need very rapid expansion. The countries, I mean, India and the United States, both, my, country of citizenship and country of residence, both are lucky in this respect that, we have good supplies of the vaccines, but other countries are just in very bad state, actually. I mean, I talked to my Canadian friends and there are no vaccines. Europeans are having problems as well. Even UK is waiting for some vaccines that our Serum Institute is supposed to supply them. Brazil is having problems, So, as a developing country, we're very uniquely placed on vaccines for sure. And sort of very greatly admire that the Prime Minister has really, pushed the vaccine diplomacy also. Pushing the traditional kind of Indian philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We try to help as much as we can without impacting negatively our own population. But all that, India has the capacity, you see. So manufacturing also needs to expand far more rapidly, and if Japan and the United States will bring in some financial resources to do that expansion, I think that's very welcome.
So, what is your view on the recent price control which has been imposed on vaccine supply by private laboratories? So, if we are getting a vaccine privately, then also the government has imposed a price control of 250 rupees. And many people are criticizing that act. So, what is your view on imposition of such price?
Yeah, no, so that's I would say because this is a necessity at this time. Maybe the price ceiling that has been suggested is too low. I don't know. I mean, it all depends what the production cost is and all. But in an emergency, look, we all know that when war happens, price controls get used. And because the shortages appear and all, so right now, given the shortages, prices could rise to excessively highly, right? This is a public good. Now, you could make the case if alternatively, for example, personally, okay, my view actually would be to use the tax revenues to give the subsidies to give everybody free vaccine, because this is a perfect example of a public good. I mean, as you know, I'm not a subsidy person. I normally I'm not favorable to subsidies, but subsidies where public good is concerned, clearly I think there is a case for subsidy, because it's if others get infected, then my chances of getting infection rise. So the benefit of vaccine doesn't accrue only to the person who takes the vaccine, but also to the rest of the population. So in that sense, it's a public good. So we ought to, if necessary, maybe combine that price ceiling to some sort of with some sort of subsidy, maybe. But all these things become difficult to administer. They do become difficult to administer, and even 250 rupees, right? I mean, I would be surprised if you don't have some people actually paying 400 instead of 250, because when the ceiling is too low, the supply disappears, right? And if they are not making at least a reasonable profit, then the supply will disappear, and it will reappear where somebody comes in and says, "I'll pay you 400." So that automatically translates into what we call the black market, right? So I don't know where the right price, whether 250 is the right price or not. But if it is the right price, in the sense that it is giving the manufacturer a reasonable profit, then in this case, I will not contest the price ceiling.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, I have one last question on education. So in the book India Unlimited, you have recommended the setting up of a higher education promotion commission to replace the UGC. So can you shed some light on how such a commission would work and how it would work better than UGC?
So in the concept, I mean, that's a very, I mean, it's not just a matter of replacing one institution by the other, but it's the matter of changing the rules, right? So it's the act which it is. The issue is the act itself, not so much the institution. And what we need, the kinds of reforms I have suggested through this Higher Education Promotion Commission are a few I'll name, for example, right? One, we need to give our institutions a lot more autonomy than they currently have. The days when the University Grants Commission would prescribe the syllabi and prescribe, what courses to teach, what constitutes a 3-year degree program, etc. All that are sort of now gone. And lots of very mature institutions exist in the country who can administer themselves autonomy. So institutional autonomy is important, to let the board run. I mean, like at Columbia University, we have no regulator. I mean, the only time that the government comes into play is when you seek a license to set up the institution. And that's at the beginning, that comes before the institution is found. But once the institution has been founded, then the board or the board of trustees actually and the president of the university basically run the university. And there is no regulator. There is no regulator. We probably still are not at a stage where we could go that far. We'll probably need some light regulation, but certainly a lot more autonomy. When a college or university wants to start a new course, allow them to start. Why does the UGC have to approve my courses? Likewise, I would allow colleges selectively at least give the right to give degrees to the colleges. There's some, I can name a few colleges which I would say, Hindu College in Delhi, St. Stephen's. If they want to develop their own name brand as independent institutions, allow them, to give their own degrees, masters and bachelors, empower them, and that way they can distinguish themselves. Why does it have to be the degree in Delhi University's name only? So I'll do that as well. I'll also, so another reform I say is like, look, for the entry of the new colleges and universities, lay down the basic criteria that what are the basic requirements that a university should satisfy. Anybody who wants to start a university satisfies those criteria should be allowed. Right now, you require a legislation. Either the state government has to pass a law or the central government has to pass a law to create an educational institution. There's no need for that. Why should that be? This whole business of affiliation also, and this is actually also in the new in the latest education policy. They accepted that this whole idea of affiliating the colleges. Ultimately, the colleges should be either autonomous or they should be integral parts of the university. This affiliation business is neither here nor there. When the university wants to interfere in the affairs of the affiliated colleges, they interfere. And if they don't want to, then they have no responsibility. But they charge, affiliating colleges have to pay a hefty fee to the university, so they are cash cows for them. But why should that be? There are some universities which are purely affiliating universities, and they do nothing else other than affiliate. And they don't even have campuses. There are even those that exist. So a number of these things need to be paid attention to. Then research side, of course, I also then suggest that we ought to have some sort of national foundation for research, something equivalent of the National Science Foundation in the United States. So that also proposal is there somewhere, I think, currently, but probably the Education Ministry is not moving fast enough.
Thank you, sir. It was wonderful to have such an enlightening discussion and to listen to you. It's always an enriching experience. I would now like to call Sakshi to deliver a vote of thanks before we end.
A very good evening, Arvind sir.
Hi.
On behalf of the informal discussion group session NUJS, I Sakshi Sharma would like to express my sincere gratitude to you. We are extremely honored that you could spare some time out of your busy schedule and grace us with your presence today. I would like to thank you for enlightening everyone present here on realms of free trade and prosperity and much more. It is a privilege for us to have interacted with you, and all of us, I'm sure, are taking something valuable from this immensely insightful session. I would also like to thank the members of the committee who contributed in making this session a wonderful and interesting session. I would like to thank the other attendees who were present and who asked such wonderful and relevant questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, sir.
Good. Thank you all, and all the best to you. India is in your hands, ultimately.